encourage and inspire us, and may we become better servants for you as a result. And we ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Last week we started a study in the book of Daniel, which it'll take us a while to get through that. There's lots in Daniel. But there's a couple things we didn't have time for last week that I want to mention before we go on. And also there was one mistake last week. I told you that in 270 BC, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Old Testament, was translated into Greek, which is all true. And I called it the Pentateuch, and it's actually the Septuagint. And it wasn't totally wrong, because the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Old Testament in Greek. It's just the law. And some of you who are my friends knew that and mentioned it to me right away afterwards. You should wave your arms and tell me right on the spot. It won't bother me, and I'd be glad for us all to not be confused, but to know the truth. Anyway, there were a couple things that we couldn't get to because we didn't have quite enough time. One of the things I mentioned in our last message, before we get to Daniel chapter 8, where we'll start today, is that the captivity, Daniel and his companions were taken to Babylon for 70 years. Is that just an arbitrary number? Is that just they happened to be there that many years before they were allowed to go back to Israel, or is there a significance in that? If we went all the way back, and we're not going to turn there, but I'm just going to mention it, in Leviticus chapter 25 verse 2 through 7, we see that Moses is being given the instructions by God on how his people are to live before him. And in that passage, they're told that every 7th day of the week is a day of rest. And every 7th year is called a Shemitah. It's a year of rest. And every 7th Shemitah, or every 49 years, which is a year of rest again, is to be followed by a 50th year of rest, which is a Jubilee. Now, we've talked about that some before. But Israel, for 490 years, had not been obeying God and had not let the land rest, had not honored the Shemitahs as God had instructed them. So what did God do? You know, if you want your own way, you can have it. God will let you have it, but there will always be consequences. God said, okay, you don't celebrate that for 490 years. I'm going to remove you from the land of Israel where I put you. And I will keep you for how long in captivity? 490 years divided by 7 Shemitahs per year is 70 years. God would get back the rest for the land that he had told his people that they should have been doing. Obedience in little things is still a big deal. And sure enough, when God had his Shemitahs back, I mean, it's a picture of perfect and satisfying justice in his sight, then the people were allowed to return. So yes, the 70 years is a particular number and for a certain reason. And again, this requirement is not for the church. It's really not for us. If you look in the writings of Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentiles, that's us, you'd look long and hard to find any place in there where we should be keeping a Shemitah, keeping a 7th year of rest, letting the land rest. But it's still true for Israel today. And you say, well, wait a minute, Israel's back in the land. Are they today keeping their Shemitahs, their 7th year rests? Largely no. And we get a clue for that if we've looked all the way back in Ezekiel chapter 37. Again, we're not going to turn there. We've looked at this chapter before. But in verses 1 through 14, we see the picture of the dry bones being brought back to life. And it's a picture in Ezekiel's prophecy of Israel being restored as a nation after this long dispersion. But one of the things that happens in there is God says, once he puts those bodies back together, he's going to breathe his life into them. That hasn't happened yet. Israel is still in unbelief. They've returned to the land in unbelief, and so they're not keeping their Shemitas. Again, there will be a price to be paid for that. But in the end, they're God's people, and God will bless them. And as we read in Romans chapter 11, there will come a day when all Israel will be saved. So we don't want to give them a bad time and say, you guys are slackers. I mean, that's between them and God. But God does want us to be obedient. And that's be a topic that's going to come up repeatedly in the book of Daniel. The second thing that we didn't have enough time for to talk about last week was when Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem. He laid siege around Jerusalem. That means they didn't just attack the wall every day. They just wait and starve them out. You know, at some point you run out of food and water and you give up. And that's the easiest way to capture a place without losing soldiers in the battle. When he first besieged Jerusalem in 605 BC, we read last week that some of the vessels of the temple were taken away into Babylon. And this is when Daniel and his companions were taken away as well. But Nebuchadnezzar had made a deal with the puppet that he had left as king in Jerusalem, and this was Jehoiakim, to sort of rule under Nebuchadnezzar in his stead. And after Jehoiakim was replaced by Zedekiah, in the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he returned for another siege because there had been a rebellion. And during this siege, Jerusalem is completely sacked and destroyed. He didn't leave a token remnant there. He completely destroyed it. And this is when everything in the temple, all the remaining vessels, whatever, were taken, as well as the temple being destroyed. Now, I reminded you of all this because this is interesting for us to know. When the temple was destroyed, the history records that it burned for 24 hours. And it happened on a particular calendar day of the year. Does anybody know what day that was? It's the 9th of Av. Today, Israel still has the 9th of Av, which usually is like in our August, as a day of mourning, a national mourning and humility before God. Interestingly enough, when Jesus stood with his disciples on the Mount of Olives and looked across at the temple, Herod's temple, he said, not one stone upon another will be remaining. In other words, Herod's temple is again to be totally destroyed. And what day on the calendar was that second temple destroyed? It was the 9th of Av. It was exactly the same day. Now, there's 360 days in the year for the Jewish calendar, so you could say, well, the chances of it happening are 1 in 360 the first time and 1 in 360 the second time, and you could figure out the probabilities of this. So it's possible that this happened by chance. But what is that day for the Jew? It's the Jews' day of national humility and mourning. I think really what it is God reminding them for perpetuity that these things happen when you disobey me. When you turn away from me, I'll put it up with it for a while, but if there's no repentance, judgment will come. They will never forget that. Every year on the 9th of Av, they celebrate that. There are other things, or they remember that. There are other things that have happened in history on that date. It's a particular date. It's not a coincidence. So, while all this is going on, if you ever watched any of those old Western movies, they'd have a scene and then they go, whoops, meanwhile, back at the ranch, this is happening. Well, while all this has been taking place that I've been discussing here, we're going to go back to the ranch now, so to speak, and we're going to Daniel chapter 8, verse 6, or chapter 1, verse 8, excuse me. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. And we're going to read about what the companions, Daniel and his companions, are doing in Babylon when they were captured and taken away at the first siege. We read this, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Our message today is really about character. And does character really matter? Paul, writing to the Corinthians, said, yeah, it does. He said, be not deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. In other words, not only should you have good character, but you shouldn't hang around with people that don't have good character as well, because they can drag you down. And in the case of Daniel, we're going to see that he's going to display character here that we'll see later on in the book of Daniel that he never changes from. This is the way he is. And in our culture today, when we talk about character, we often have kind of a misunderstanding. We say that, well, you know, he might have really good character or he might have bad character. But I don't think that's the right way to look at it. In Greek, the word for character, which is where we get our word character, it's the word character. And it's the word used for a stamp that's put on something that leaves a permanent mark. I like that. What we talk about when we talk about character is either you have it or you lack it. You don't have that stamp. In other words, there's not any really bad character. It's either you have character or you don't. And in the case of these four youths right here that we're going to talk about this morning, they're going to display the mark of character that is so often lacking in our society today. And an example of that is on the 4th of February, a U.S. senator from this state, you'll probably know the name, I don't need to mention it, blocked a bill that would prevent requiring doctors and nurses to provide care for an infant that's born alive after a failed abortion. In other words, someone goes in for abortion, there's a mistake, the baby's born alive. The bill would say, okay, you need to protect that infant and take care of it. And this senator blocked that bill. In other words, this senator is for infanticide. Not only is it bad enough that we kill babies in the womb, but once they're born alive, we don't want them, we can continue to kill them. And this is an issue that's all around us in our culture today. This is a mark of a complete lack of character. I would have to say that person has no soul. And you should remember that the next time you go to the ballot box to vote, because when we allow people with no character in positions of authority, it can make a big difference in the lives that we lead in our country. Character does matter. And in verse 6, it says Daniel made up his mind. That's my translation. In the Hebrew, it actually says he made up his heart. Now, we've talked about this before. Verse 8. Yes, thank you, Chris. In verse 8, Daniel made up his mind. Actually, he made up his heart. And in Hebrew, that word is leb. We've talked about this word before. It's just two letters. It's lamed bet. And in the ancient Hebrew, before this captivity took place, if you looked at those letters, the lamed is the picture of a shepherd's staff. And it's a picture that reminds us of the authority or leadership. And bet is the picture of the floor plan of the tent. When you look at it, you could say, oh yeah, that's the dwelling place, it's the home. And in the word heart, we get the picture of who's in charge of the house or who's in authority in the house. The heart is where the decisions are really made for the Hebrew. It's not in the mind, it's in the heart. Who you are is determined by what's in your heart. And in Daniel's heart, he's already purposed the way he's going to live. He's already decided who he's going to be. And this is interesting because in the culture that he was in, it's not that much different than the culture we live in today. He's in a culture with pagan, foreign gods that are in charge. His beliefs are contrary to what's going to be going on all around him. if he raises his hand and says, wait a minute, this is wrong because I know this from my God, will he be a popular person in society? No. He will be ostracized. He's taking a difficult stand. But interestingly, he's okay with that. You know, they tried to change his name from Daniel, God is my judge, to Belteshazzar, which means Bel is the great God. He's the God of thunder and lightning. He's okay with that. He doesn't mind being called by a pagan God's name. And why? Because it's not going to change what's in his heart. He already knows who he is. He knows who the real God is. That's not going to change anything. And as well, we read that he's going to be taught the culture in Babylon. He's going to be taught all their rules, their customs. He's going to be taught about their gods, for instance. And he's okay with that as well. And why is that? Because he knows who the real God is. That's not going to change. He's already, in his heart, decided the leadership, who's in control of the house. But when it comes to the food, Daniel puts his foot down. He said no. And why? Because he says he did not want to be defiled. Defile, that word in Hebrew is to pollute or to stain. He did not want that to happen to him. You say, well, how could he say it's okay for two things and not for the third? Well, there's reasoning behind that. So let's look at that for a minute. We know, we'll talk about food just for a minute. I know some of you have asked about this. We know that we need to discriminate with our diet. Every good mother knows you can't let your kid just have Hershey bars every day. There's somewhere got to be broccoli in there. And that's just the way it is. We know that. And in my own case, I've learned that Hershey bars every day is not very good for me. It tells my body, the sugar tells me store it fat for winter, and I turn like this. So we know that we should be more careful about our food, but God has given us food. And interestingly, we'll take just a moment and look at a few verses about the food that God has given us in the Bible, because it's him that knows us best and him that we should be pleasing. So if we go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, Genesis 21:29, we read this. Then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. So broccoli, avocados, those are good. God says these are food for you. Great. So now let's turn over to Genesis chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, verse 3. He continues, and he enlarges the scope here, not just seed-bearing plants and trees, but every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give all to you, as I gave the green plant. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. So, salmon, round steak, this is now on the diet as well. This is okay. If I go now to Acts chapter 15, verse 28, I begin to get a picture now of why Daniel made the stand that he made. In Acts chapter 15, verse 28, and by the way, in verse 23, we read that this passage is written to the brethren in Antioch. In other words, this is to the church. These are to people who have committed their lives to Christ. In verse 28, we read of Acts chapter 15, for it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these essentials, that you abstain from things sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourselves free from such things, you will do well. Farewell. In Daniel's case, the food from the king's table that was offered to him almost always was food, meat, and wine were offered to the false gods, to the idols, to the pagan gods. And that was a problem for some. Now, if I'm going to continue here, I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 4 will describe this situation a little more. Here Paul writes, "Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols," which is what Daniel was concerned about, "we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there's no God but one." Now, wait a minute. He's saying an idol is nothing. They don't exist. They're false gods. So you're no better off in abstaining from meat sacrificed to idols, and you're no better off if you do. It's not an issue, except if we skip down to verse 9, Paul continues, "But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." In other words, some of the people that this letter was directed to in Antioch that we just read out of Acts, some of those people had come out of a culture of serving pagan gods and offering sacrifices to them. And Paul said, when you do this, you're putting them back in that old life. It's like a slippery slope. You're reintroducing them to the things that they've come out of. You'd be better off not doing that. It's not that there's anything wrong with that food. It's what it could cause brothers around you to do. So now I want to go all the way back to Exodus chapter 34, verse 15. This is our last verse about food here, but this again explains, to me at least, why Daniel made the stand that he made. In Exodus 34:15, we're talking about worshiping false gods and submitting to them, and that our God is a jealous God, and he doesn't like that. And in verse 15 we read this, "Otherwise, you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods and cause your sons also to play the harlot." In other words, there's a slippery slope painted for us here, that when you do some things, in the case of meat sacrifice to idols, you say, well, it's not that big a thing. Idol's really nothing. You open your door to incrementalism, where little by little you're lulled into sleep, and you're sliding down the path towards some despicable act of idolatry you would have never committed otherwise. That's not something you would ever thought about doing, and yet you can be led into that if you have not predetermined in your heart to never go that direction. And that's where Daniel is. Let's go back now to verse 9. Verse 8, one more thing. Daniel didn't just say, I'm not going to do it and you can't make me. Now, we all have had children who at one point in life have said something like that to us. And actually, we do at that moment, if we're good parents, say, well, actually, yes, I can. But Daniel doesn't do that. He makes a very polite request. We have to remember when Jesus came in Matthew, we're told he came gentle and humble in spirit. You want to persuade people? There's the tack you should take. It's not be this wild, I'm not going to and you can't make me kind of a person. Even if it's the right thing, even if you're in the right, you don't want to start that way. You want to start gentle and humble in spirit. Because when you do that, it gives God an opportunity to work. And now, in Daniel chapter 1, verse 9, now God granted Daniel favor and compassion. That's God working when you take the direction he wants you to take. You're doing the right thing, but you're not flaunting it or demanding and insisting on it. You're just saying, this is important to me. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel in verse 10, I'm afraid of my lord the king who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should I see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. We don't often think about this because we mostly think about ourselves, but the actions and the decisions we make affect other people. Daniel's stand is putting the commander in a tough spot, because if Daniel does not pass the test we're going to see here in a minute, the commander's head can be taken off. And Nebuchadnezzar is not a sweet, gentle, really good pally kind of guy. He executed his own commanders regularly for disobedience. And so this was not an idle threat. This commander says, this, what you're asking me to do, this is a big deal. And an example of this, which I've thought about this a lot, you guys probably remember in 2014, I think, Hobby Lobby, the owners of this national company, Hobby Lobby, were Christians, and they discovered that in the Affordable Health Care Act, which they were required to provide health insurance for their employees, in that was a provision that meant that part of the health care money they were going to be giving them would be used for abortions. And they said, we can't do that. That's against our conscience. And that court went all the way to, that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in the end, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor and said, yes, your religious convictions mean that you do not have to fund abortions because it's against your conscience, because it's against what your Bible has taught you. But they could have lost, because that's the direction our culture is going. And if they had lost, what would it have cost to make that stand? They displayed character. They did the right thing. They did what they knew they should do. They could have lost their businesses. If they'd lost the court case, they maybe would have closed their businesses rather than do what they knew was wrong. In the meantime, all the employees are being slandered as well. You work for Hobby Lobby? Why, you're just one of those evil people just like them. That's the kind of culture we live in. It wasn't that different in Daniel's day. These were not going to be popular things that they were going to be insisting on. So, what does Daniel do? Verse 11, 12, and 13 now. Daniel said to the overseer whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. In other words, bring on the broccoli. I'm gonna put my God to the test before you, and we'll see what happens. You have to say this is a miracle. All of the youth, not just these four, but they're going to be compared to, they've all been hand selected. These are not the scrawny. We've already read. These were the number one fit and intelligent men in the kingdom of Israel that had been taken into Nebuchadnezzar's training. And in 10 days' time, do you think eating broccoli is going to make a healthy young man look more healthy and strong than another healthy young man? I don't think so. I think God is at work supernaturally behind the scenes here. But again, there are no coincidences in the Bible. Why does it say for 10 days? Why not a week? Why not 2 weeks? Why not a month? If it's going to work in 10 days, it'll surely work better in a month. Everyone will see. Why 10 days? Well, for that, we're going to turn back to Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. And this is a letter from Jesus Christ to one of the churches, the church at Smyrna. In Revelation 2:10 we read this, "Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you in prison so that you will be tested." Here we see, again, Daniel's being tested. "And you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you a crown of life." What does that mean? You'll be tested for 10 days. I asked a lot of Christians that when I first came across that in the Bible. None of them knew. Then I asked a Jew one day. He said, "Well, every Jew knows what that means." It refers to something we've talked about before. Every fall, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, which is in our September usually, the trumpet is blown and the faithful are called in for a 10-day period, which is ended with Yom Kippur, the sacrifice of the lamb by the high priest in the temple to cover the sins of the nation for one more year takes place. In fact, the 9th day, they fast for 24 hours, all of Israel, both man and woman, food and drink, as well as the livestock. This was a big deal. Your salvation is hanging in the balance. That's why this 10 days appears here. It's testing of the most severe kind. You feel the pressure. But what happens as a result of this testing that God puts us through? This testing of the worst kind. For those in Leviticus, if the sacrifice was accepted, you're good to go for one more year. You were forgiven. You were good with God for another year. And if it was rejected, you were out. You were out of Israel, and there was no way back ever. You never had another way back to God. There's not one offered anywhere. In the case of those in Revelation, what were they told they would get? The crown of life. This testing of the worst kind would result in God providing them a crown of life. And in Daniel's case, it's not any different. If he fails the test, but still refuses because of his conscience not to eat the king's food, what will happen? Insubordination will not be tolerated in this land. Nebuchadnezzar would not just remove Daniel and his friends from office, they would have been killed as well as the commander. So this is testing of the worst kind. So now let's go back. This number 10, is one of God's perfect numbers. And we'll talk about this more because this number, again, is going to show up over and over in the book of Daniel. We'll see in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, there's 10 toes, and there are 10 kingdoms, and there are 10 horns. Each time this comes up, there's a significance with that. And we'll talk about that more when we get to those. But it's not an accident that it was 10 days. So, back again to Daniel. Let's go to verse 17. Actually, back to verse 14. So he listened to them in this matter. This is the commander listening to Daniel and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. That is a miracle. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink and kept giving to them. And the word vegetables is again, that which is grown from seed. Broccoli. As for these 4 youths, verse 17, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. Here we begin to see some of the rewards that come from being faithful to your conscience, for doing the things that you know in your heart you should be doing, the marks of character. Because character really is doing what you know to be the right thing to do, even when there's no one watching. When you're all alone and you're in secret, then what do? That's when we really see what people's character is like. And we'll see Daniel alone and what his character is like later on. When he's tested again, he spent his time prostrate before God. But there is a reward for this character. And the reward is given to us here in verse 17. First it says they're going to be given knowledge. In Hebrew that is the Elohim knowledge. They're going to be given the knowledge that only God has. Now that's something sweet. Every one of us would want that. And yet, we're told in the New Testament we can have the mind of Christ. It's available for us if we pursue him, if we put our trust in Christ, if he becomes our rock, we can have his mind. We can have the Elohim knowledge. That's amazing. But it also says, at least in my translation, says intelligence in every branch of literature. Now, if I look around the room, some of you I know are good at math. Some of you might be good at astronomy. Some of you might be really good at biology. Some of you, like Katrine, you might be good at languages. You might know a lot of different languages, have good skills. But nobody is good at all those things. We have areas we're really good, but nobody's good at everything. And yet, that's what we're told right here. These four men are given a gift from God. They're going to be good at all these things. And the wisdom that we read about in verse 17, we think, well, the Bible tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But that's not what this word means. That's not what we're talking about here. Daniel did have that, but this is different. This type of wisdom is the skilled craftsman or the skilled inventor. He understands learning. In other words, this is the guy that says, I see the problem. I know what we can build and we can fix it. We can make it work. Maybe it's the plugged culvert at the end of the driveway, whatever it might be. This is a different kind of wisdom. This is kind of wisdom when you hire guys in your company and you want, look, we need to figure out how to do this and how to get it done and make it work. These are the guys you want. And God has given them wisdom. And not just wisdom. It's in Hebrew, the same thing is true of the dreams and visions. It's in everything. In other words, in every case, in every instance. Doesn't matter what problem you put before them. Doesn't matter what difficulty it is. These four guys, they know how to do it. They understand it. They can see it. Chris and I play a word game once in a while together, and in this word game, once in a while, I say, oh, I can see that, and the letters are all jumbled, and you can immediately see the word. Well, these guys could see the puzzle, the problem, and they knew how to make it go. It's a gift from God. The other kids that they brought from from Israel with them, they did not have this gift. This has come as a result of being faithful, showing that character that God wants us to all display. But because Daniel has led the charge, he's the one that's been out front on all this. His other friends, we don't read that much about them. We don't know what it was like for them to come from their homes and their families to be scattered and drug across the country and put in a foreign land and forced to learn all these things. We don't know what that's like. But we know Daniel led the charge here, and because of that, he's given one final blessing. He will even understand all kinds of visions and dreams. And in Hebrew, again, that's in every case, in every dream, there will not be anything that Daniel, through the power given him by God, will not be able to understand. And this will be important pretty quick. We'll see this, because Nebuchadnezzar is going to be a dreamer. Verse 18, then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. You know, when you study, you learn something, you take a test. That shows how much you've learned. Nebuchadnezzar is actually not a fool. He might have been a powerful ruler that showed no mercy on those that disobeyed, but he's a smart character, and he personally interviewed and tested all the applicants and picked these 4. They were head and shoulders above everyone else, and that was God's doing. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them not just better, here's that word again, 10 times better. This is God's perfect number again. Better than all the magicians and the conjurers. Now these are the scribes and the magi. We read about the magi even in Luke. We'll talk about them later on in Daniel. Better than all the magi and conjurers who were in his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Cyrus the king will come up again too. When we see Daniel in chapter 9, we'll see Cyrus, who's an unbeliever, is going to be the one that not only sets the date for the Israelites to return to Israel, but to announce the exact date that the Messiah would come. An unbeliever. So, that's where we're going to leave Daniel and his friends today. And for a takeaway for this, do not fail to be obedient to the God that you know and you serve. Display in your character the things that you know are right. God will reward you for being faithful. There may be a price to pay, there may be a cost. It will always be worth it, because at the end, it's life that God is promising us. It's what he promised in Revelation. That's what he promised in Leviticus chapter 24. And it's what he promises Daniel as well. Lord, thank you again for your word, and thank you for your encouragement to us. May we, as we go this week, be those who stand out, not because